Okay, welcome students to yet another of the online video lectures. This one on Johann Gottfried Herder, somebody who kind of took and systematized a lot of the themes we see in Hamann. He was born to poor parents in the same area that Hamann and Kant were living in, Königsberg. He was actually a student of Kant's, though later he would become one of Kant's fiercest critics. He was a good friend of Hamann's, criticizing him. He was a good friend of Hamann's and was deeply influenced by him. He had an illustrious career teaching and preaching. He was a theology student, he was educated in theology. And his own influence was widespread, especially on the Sturm und Drang literary movement. That is the Storm and Stress literary movement, a group who wrote during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. They stressed feeling over reason, inspiration over analysis, action and rebellion over against social convention and social conformity. For example, take Friedrich Schiller's tragic tale of heartbreak and teen rebellion, Die Rauber, the Robbers. It's about a young man who falls in love with a girl who is beneath him in social status, and his father says, "No, you may not marry this commoner." And the kid goes, "You don't understand me. You don't understand my love. You don't understand anything." And he goes and he gets a bunch of other like-minded, alienated teens, and they they become highwaymen. They become robbers who, attack horse-drawn carriages carrying rich people and stuff like that. And after some time living the high life of crime, the group is finally captured and the guy is hanged. And it's a beautiful, tragic ending. So let's look at Herder's ideas. Herder took many of Hamann's themes, language, feeling, uniqueness, the uniqueness and the unity of a human being, and gave them a more precise theoretical expression. He is best known as the founder of historicism, which we now know as cultural relativism. That is, each period of history, each culture has its own truth. It's not just one truth, as the Enlightenment said, but it's a lot of different truths, because there are a lot of different perspectives. But for our purposes, that is, for the development of the Romantic worldview, we're going to look at his conception of the expressivist identity. What do we mean by the expressivist identity? The expressivist identity is the belief that the subject is defined, the person is defined by his ability to express himself or herself in the world. And this idea changed the way we think about art, think about language, think about the meaning of life. What's life about? It's about expression. It marks a radical shift from the doctrines of the Enlightenment. So how does he get to this expressivist identity? Well, Herder begins with the idea that feeling is the beginning of thought. The Enlightenment thought more about thinking as like sight. Abstract reason is like sight. It keeps things at a distance. But feeling brings you into immediate contact with another. You feel their energy. You feel their resistance, their body on your body. And at the same time, that helps you feel your body. Now, we're going to talk a lot about subject and object. And you guys may not be familiar with this terminology. So when I say subject, I mean a human subject and his or her internal world, right? The you that's you, the inside you. An object is everything around you, everything else, other people, other things, the world. And so the Enlightenment would say, yeah, subject and object are kind of separated because of Cartesian dualism, actually, whereas Herder wanted to change up the game and say, no, 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 subject and object kind of appear together. There is a childlike immediacy of feeling. The child, as in this picture, becomes aware of another as it feels another, becomes aware of itself or herself as she feels another. Feeling brings a level of self-consciousness as well as world consciousness. This is very, very different from Descartes. For Herder, subject and object are experienced together. As I feel the object, I become a feeling subject. However, we don't stop at this childlike immediacy of feeling. We lose it as we grow distant from the world that we felt so immediately as children. Humans, unlike animals, mature into reflection. We reflect on what we feel. We reflect on the world around us, and we express that through language and art. So where does language come from? Well, the Enlightenment philosopher Condillac, in his book, has a theory about this. And Herder, in his book on the origin of language, he considers Condillac's view. And Condillac imagines a scenario in which you have two children in a desert or in a jungle, and one child points to a tree and goes, "Tree," and the other one nods and goes, "Tree," and then the first one points to the sky and goes, "Sky," and the other one nods and goes, "Sky," and then the first one points to the ground and goes, "Ground," and in that way they learn language. But Herder responds, once you do that, you've already kind of glossed over the very first question. How is it that these children had the idea that one thing, a vocal utterance like tree, can stand for another thing, like a real tree out in the world? How did they get there? That's the question. Herder believed that it was far more likely that language started through listening to the world and imitating natural sounds. So tree might have started as imitating the sound of leaves going through the trees, or rustler, or a brook as murmur, 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 fly as buzz, right? And then the kids would imitate those natural sounds. The world speaks and we imitate what the world gives. And he says, because of our God-given ability to take concrete instances and generalize, abstract and generalize about them, we find common characteristics and we express that. In other words, the world speaks and humans follow its example. So instead of just pointing to a tree and going, "Tree," we go, "Oh, all these things sound this way when wind blows through the leaves. Oh, they all must be or rustlers, or all these things, all these wet things make sound like murmur, murmur, murmur. They all must be murmurers." And in this way, language is formed, Herder hypothesized. All of this is to say that humans have the unique and innate ability to reflect on their world, to kind of separate themselves from the world and then reflect on it and express that reflection in language. We move from a childlike, like when we're kids, we move from an immediate experience of the world through feeling, to a mediated experience through language, or especially feeling in language. Art and language are the means by which we express our connection with the world and our ability to reflect on the world. Unlike the Enlightenment's separateness and alienation and distance from the world, because the stance they take is one of observing and controlling the world, Herder believed that we need an engagement with the world in order to express our feelings through language and art. Thus, our subjectivity, our understanding of ourselves as selves, or rather, my understanding of myself as a self, depends on the objectivity of the medium through which, or the media through which we express ourselves, whether those media are words, or paints, or clay, or musical instruments. My subjectivity is expressed and reflected on through objective media in language and the arts. Which leads us to a change in the way Herder and Romantics thought about the nature of art. Herder's thought marks a shift from a mimetic understanding of art, where art imitates the world, to an expressive understanding of art. Art and language aren't just for describing and mirroring what's out there. No, art's for expressing what's in the heart, the internal emotional state of the artist in relation to the world. Not just mimicking, but expressing what's inside. And the same goes for language. It isn't just clothing for ideas, ways to put ideas into boxes, as the Enlightenment philosophers said. Rather, art and language are for expressing who we are, our inward desires and feelings in a concrete form, clarifying our feelings, connecting our experience of the world with our own inner passions and desires. And the way that we express ourselves depends on the unique language and culture that we find ourselves in. My expression in English will be different from a person's expression in Czech. And for those of you who don't know a lot of Czech, the guy on the left is saying "Jak se máš," which is "how you doing?" And the English dude goes "what?" And the Czech guy goes "bulbsa," which means idiot. Only Maya would get that without me explaining it to you. Later on in his career, Herder talked about poetry as the center of language and feeling for the people, or what he called Volkgeist, the spirit of the people. And it's the old, uneducated poets who are most in touch with this, not the academic types. Everyone in a language is guided by this feeling to some extent. In a sense, language speaks us rather than simply us having sovereign control over the language. That who we are, who we're born into, the language we're born in, the culture we're born into, will give us a vocabulary for speaking. So in a sense, it's language speaking, it's our culture speaking. Language isn't just about transmitting reason or ideas about things. It's about expressing our feelings and our cultural spirit, the feelings of our culture, the feeling rooted in our culture. Herder encouraged the use of the then despised German language instead of Latin, which was then the international language of scholarship. It was a way to get in touch with your linguistic roots, your cultural feeling, your cultural spirit. But there was a dark side to this type of Romanticism, as we will discuss later when we're doing the critique, because it likely gave rise to the strong nationalistic feelings that led to anti-Semitism and National Socialism. But back to the expressivist subject. So for the Romantics, art is not primarily about reproducing the outside world. Rather, it is primarily about expressing the inner world of the artist, the heart, the imagination. Goethe, the author of The Young Werther, said that art is a type of, quote, purification of feeling. It's sort of close quote, it's sort of a crystallization of what's in the heart. It's an experience of the heart on a higher level than if it was just left in the heart. And therefore, art expands the existence of the artist. It enlarges his soul, and it enlarges the souls of those who partake in the artist's creation. While at the same time, in art, the culture's feeling, the collective imagination, the collective spirit emerges and comes to expression in art. Because art is rooted in culture. So human life, therefore, is all about expression. That's what we mean by the expressivist subject. My identity, my very personhood is achieved to the extent that my inner feeling is clarified in an outward expression. Let me say that again, because a lot of times students miss it. My identity, my personhood is achieved to the very extent that my inner feeling is clarified by and through an outward expression. The very purpose of life, according to Romanticism, is to achieve authentic expression of what is inside me, despite the outside world and social conventions' resistance to me. And you see that really clearly in the young Werther, right? And the person that is expressed is seen by Herder and the Romantics as a unified being, not an animal with a kind of a rationality tacked on, as they understood the way the Enlightenment viewed human beings. A person must be seen as a unity of feeling and thought, or better, thought through feeling. Feeling as a way of knowing the world, and thought as the reflection of that feeling of the world. These emphases on, number one, the expressivist subject, number two, the unity of a person, and number three, knowing the world through feeling and reflection on feeling, meant that art and the artist as a creator becomes immensely important for being human. Art came to be seen in the West, and is still seen in the West to some extent, as a quasi-religion, a religion substitute, as the one thing that can really give a human being a sense of completeness, of unity, of peace. From this point on in the West, art sort of does become a religion substitute. Now, in some ways, art seems to be a good substitute for religion. It gives this sense of transcendence, of power, of the sublime. And you guys don't know what this is, but this is the poet from Kubla Khan. I'm going to read that in class next when we go over the young Werther, when we start talking about the imagination and the sublime, or especially passion and the sublime. We'll talk about Coleridge's poem. But for right now, all you need to know is art gives us an access to the sublime, and therefore a lot of romantics and a lot of artists felt that it does what religion is supposed to do. On the other hand, in some ways, art does not make a good substitute for religion at all. Being subjective as art is, it tends to give very little ethical guidance. Art is better at asking questions and pushing envelopes and pushing the limits than giving answer. So, for example, this picture on the left of this guy with the kind of scary eyes, that's a still from the film Art School Confidential, a film from 2006, in which a young art student who is like, he goes to art school and everybody has to do something unique and special, and he's like really struggling to find what's going to be his thing. And he meets this guy who's actually a serial killer and does these very expressive paintings of his victims using their blood. And I'm not going to spoil the movie, but it's been out since 2006. But the kid is like, yeah, this is my thing. Like, that is a really bad thing to do in the name of art, killing. But in case you think that's just the movies, take a real life example like Pablo Picasso, who was a freaking creative genius, but he had this pattern when it came to women. He would find a sweet young thing, a beautiful woman, and he would make her his muse. And then he would abuse them, sexually, emotionally, humiliate them, just kind of use them up until they're nothing but an empty shell, and then discard them and move on to the next woman. And he did that throughout his life. He was a creative genius, but he was not a good man. If art does try to speak too directly or heavily about ethical issues, it kind of ceases being art and becomes propaganda or merely kind of educational, ethical education. Art doesn't do real well as an ethical guide for life. It does make one more aesthetically sophisticated. You become more cultured and more artistically aware, but being morally good and being aesthetically sophisticated do not necessarily go hand in hand. Just ask this guy, and if you don't know, this is Hannibal Lecter from The Silence of the Lambs. And in the movie, he's a serial killer, but he's such a refined serial killer. He kills people with the utmost sophistication. He eats their livers with fava beans and a nice Chianti, right? The arts. My point is, the arts don't make you a better person. They just make you more culturally sophisticated. Now, here's the wrinkle. Art is also seen in the Romantics, and in Herder in particular, as a key to our unity with nature. Herder believed that through what he called universal sympathy, that is, knowing the world through feeling, and especially the feeling of love, we could be united with nature. We could have a sympathy that is expressed supremely in art, as opposed to the way the Enlightenment treated nature. It related to nature as just a bunch of raw materials to be analyzed and controlled and manipulated and exploited. Romanticism strives for harmony with the natural world, and more than that, more than just harmony, for oneness, to kind of sink into nature, to be one with the world. So these two great themes emerge from Romanticism, and they're clarified in the work of Herder. Number one, a deep yearning for freedom for the expressivist subject. For the expressive subject. Human life, language, and art are all about freely expressing your feelings and your culture's spirit, its emotional roots, all of that through art and language. And on the other hand, there's a deep yearning for unity, seeking a way of understanding human beings that sees them as a whole and is unified with the whole world around them, especially nature, in which case you sort of lose yourself in nature. So there's a problem in saying both. The question arises, how are we to understand this romantic notion of communion with nature. What must nature be for us to be able to commune with it, to become one with it? If nature is simply an object, if it's simply a collection of things out there, trees and rabbits and whatever, then is our communion with it anything more than simply a projection of our own subjectivity onto nature? Isn't it just a comforting illusion, a fiction that we tell ourselves to feel all poetic and nice? Or, the other alternative, is nature somehow itself spiritual? That is, nature is itself a subject. Some romantics thought this, that nature is sort of a sleeping spirit, sort of a sleeping god, or that somehow we complete nature's subjectivity. That's the route that Gottfried Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel went. GWF Hegel. Our goal then is to place ourselves in harmony with this great current of life, the great spiritual force of nature, to sort of merge with it, to erase ourselves and lose ourselves in it. This kind of pantheism that sees the world as a sort of god was, for a lot of romantics, a trademark of Romanticism. This was not Herder's position, mind you. He was a Christian, at least in name, and Christians don't believe that the world is God. But this solution, absolute unity with nature, kind of being absorbed into the spirituality of nature, runs counter to that other great theme of Romanticism, the radically free subject. See, if you merge with the spirit of nature, you lose yourself in it. And there is no more self. There is no more separate self. If, on the other hand, you stay free, then you remain separated and alienated from nature. You can't have both. How do you reconcile these two longings of the Romantics? To be one with nature, or to be one with the romantic object, whatever that object is, whether that's nature or Charlotte or whatever, or how can you be free at the same time? Or if you're completely free and you're like, I need my freedom, how do you unite? That's the tension inherent in Romanticism. You can't have both, but they sure did want both. And you had a lot of smart people writing books about how to reconcile the two, none of which, at least in my opinion, did it completely convincingly. Okay, so that's our that's the lecture. Thank you for listening, and thank you for saving us almost a half an hour of class time where we can do something else. But listen, guys, I want you to be bringing questions, things you don't understand, because I can talk, but it doesn't make any sense unless you actually understand and bring questions to class where you don't understand. Okay? Have a great day, and I will see you in class later. Bye-bye.